In 1954, a housing project opened in St. Louis, Missouri. It was designed by one of America's most celebrated architects. It won awards. It was featured in magazines. Politicians called it the future of urban living. Within 2 decades, it had become so dangerous, so unlivable, that the government had no choice but to blow it up. All of it. 33 buildings reduced to rubble. And the man who designed it? He went on to create the World Trade Center. This is the story of Pruitt-Igoe. And it's a warning about what happens when designers forget that buildings aren't just structures. They're places where human beings have to actually live. To understand Pruitt-Igoe, you have to understand St. Louis in the 1940s. The city was booming, but the housing situation was a disaster. The inner city was crowded with tenements, crumbling buildings, shared bathrooms, families packed into single rooms, conditions that would be condemned as inhumane today. The federal government had a solution: public housing, brand new apartments for working-class families, clean, modern, safe. And St. Louis would get one of the largest projects in the country. Enter Minoru Yamasaki, a young architect with big ideas. Yamasaki believed in something called modernist design, the idea that architecture should be pure, functional, stripped of ornament, buildings as machines for living. He would later become famous worldwide. But in 1950, he was given his first major commission: design housing for 12,000 people. His vision was ambitious: 33 towers, 11 stories each, spread across 57 acres. The buildings would have skip-stop elevators, meaning they only stopped on certain floors. This would save money and encourage residents to use communal galleries, long open hallways where neighbors could socialize. The galleries were supposed to create community. Instead, they created something very different. The project was segregated at first. The Pruitt section for black residents, the Igoe section for white residents. By the time it opened, though, the Supreme Court had ruled segregation unconstitutional. So the buildings became integrated on paper. But white residents, who had other housing options, quickly left. Pruitt-Igoe became almost entirely black within a few years. And this demographic shift would matter enormously for what came next. Here's what's fascinating about Pruitt-Igoe. For the first few years, residents actually liked it. They wrote letters praising their new homes. They described the joy of having their own bathroom for the first time, their own kitchen, windows that looked out on open space instead of brick walls. So what went wrong? The answer involves money, racism, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what people actually need from their homes. And it's a mistake that's still being made today in cities around the world. The problem started almost immediately, even during the good years. And they came from decisions that seemed sensible at the time. First, the funding model. Pruitt-Igoe had to be self-sustaining. All maintenance costs had to come from rent. No government subsidies for upkeep. This meant every time a family couldn't pay rent, the building lost money for repairs. And the residents of Pruitt-Igoe were poor, working class at best. Many were on welfare. When the economy dipped, rent collection collapsed. Second, the design choices that seemed so innovative became nightmares. Those skip-stop elevators? They meant that some floors had no elevator access at all. Elderly residents had to walk upstairs. Mothers with strollers had to carry them. And if an elevator broke, it stayed broken for months because there was no money to fix it. The communal galleries were even worse. Yamasaki imagined neighbors gathering there to chat. Instead, they became no man's land. Long corridors with no one taking responsibility for them. No one owned them, so no one maintained them. They filled with garbage. Then crime, muggings, assaults. Residents became afraid to leave their apartments. By the early 1960s, vacancy rates began to climb. The families who could leave did. The ones who stayed were those with nowhere else to go. And as the population changed, so did the buildings themselves. Without maintenance money, small problems became catastrophes. Broken windows stayed broken. Heating systems failed. Plumbing backed up. The stairwells that people were forced to use because the elevators didn't work became prime locations for crime. A pattern emerged. Crime would spike in one building. Residents would abandon it. The empty apartments would attract squatters, addicts, anyone looking for shelter. And that building would drag down its neighbors. The decay spread like a disease. By 1970, Pruitt-Igoe had become internationally infamous. Journalists came to document what they called an urban jungle. Politicians used it as an example of government failure. And architects? They started asking uncomfortable questions. Was modernist design fundamentally flawed? Could buildings actually cause social breakdown? We're going to answer those questions. But first, I want to tell you about what life was actually like inside those towers. Because the people who lived there have stories that rarely get told. The standard narrative about Pruitt-Igoe focuses on crime and decay. But that's not the whole story. People lived there, raised children there, built communities there. And their experiences are more complicated than the headlines suggest. Ruth lives in Chicago now. She spent her childhood in Pruitt-Igoe in the early 60s. When interviewed, she remembered the buildings fondly at first. She remembered playing in the courtyards with dozens of other kids. She remembered summer evenings when families would sit outside together because the apartments had no air conditioning. She remembered knowing everyone in her building by name. She also remembered when things changed. The feeling of safety disappearing almost overnight. Her mother warning her to never use the stairs alone. The day they found a body in the laundry room. The night someone tried to break into their apartment. But here's what Ruth emphasized. The problems didn't come from the residents. They came from abandonment. From a city that stopped investing. From a country that wrote off public housing as a failed experiment rather than fixing it. The people inside those buildings weren't criminals or welfare cases. They were families trying to survive in a system designed to fail them. This distinction matters enormously. Because the way we tell the Pruitt-Igoe story shapes how we think about poverty, race, and cities even today. If the buildings failed because poor people lived there, then the solution is to not build housing for poor people. If the buildings failed because of design flaws and funding cuts, then the solution is to design better buildings and fund them properly. The evidence strongly supports the second interpretation. Similar buildings in other cities with better funding and management survived. But that's not the lesson that was learned. Instead, Pruitt-Igoe became an excuse to abandon public housing altogether. The image is iconic. A tower imploding, dust clouds billowing outward. A building that was supposed to last generations reduced to rubble in seconds. On July 15, 1972, the first of the Pruitt-Igoe towers came down. Over the next 4 years, the rest followed. 12,000 units of housing gone. The architectural critic Charles Jencks famously declared that modernist architecture died at exactly 3:32 p.m. on that July afternoon. He was being dramatic, but he was also making a serious point. Pruitt-Igoe represented everything modernism believed in. Clean lines, functional design, the idea that good architecture could solve social problems. And it had failed spectacularly. The pendulum swung. Suddenly, everything modernism stood for was suspect. Those pure geometric forms, cold and inhuman. That rejection of ornament, sterile and unwelcoming. The whole idea that architects knew better than the people who would live in their buildings, arrogant and naive. Postmodernism emerged as the reaction. Buildings with historical references, with decoration, with acknowledgement that people have emotional needs, not just functional ones. The skylines of our cities today are shaped by the rejection of what Pruitt-Igoe represented. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The critique went too far. Because Pruitt-Igoe didn't fail, because modernism is bad. It failed because it was underfunded, racially segregated, and deliberately abandoned by the city that built it. The design flaws mattered, yes. The skip-stop elevators and endless galleries were mistakes. But those mistakes could have been fixed. What couldn't be fixed was the political decision to stop trying. After Pruitt-Igoe, America largely gave up on public housing. The projects that were built in later years were smaller, lower, designed to be unobtrusive. And often they weren't built at all. The political will simply wasn't there. Meanwhile, cities with better support systems showed different results. Vienna's public housing, built in the same era with similar modernist principles, thrives to this day. Singapore's public housing, designed at massive scale, houses 80% of the population successfully. The difference isn't architecture, it's commitment. Today, the site where Pruitt-Igoe stood is an urban forest. Nature reclaimed what humanity abandoned. You can walk through it and find traces of the old roads, the foundations of buildings that once housed thousands. It's peaceful now, almost beautiful. But it's also a monument to failure. The affordable housing crisis in American cities today is directly connected to what happened here. When we decided that public housing was a failed experiment, we stopped building it. And the gap between what people need and what the market provides has only grown wider. Vienna builds public housing that middle-class families want to live in. Singapore builds public housing that creates mixed-income communities. America builds almost nothing, then acts surprised when homelessness increases and rents spiral out of control. Pruitt-Igoe wasn't destroyed by bad architecture. It was destroyed by racism, by underfunding, and by a political system that found it easier to abandon poor black families than to support them. The buildings had flaws, yes, but those flaws were symptoms, not causes. Today, when you hear someone argue against public housing, against density, against any attempt to house people who can't afford market rates, remember Pruitt-Igoe. Not as a cautionary tale about government overreach, but as a cautionary tale about what happens when we give up too easily. The people who lived there deserve better. And the millions of people struggling to afford housing today deserve better too. The question is whether we've learned enough to actually do better, or whether we're still making the same mistakes, just with better graphics. If you want to understand more about how design shapes society, and how society shapes design, stick around. I'll see you in the next one.